All right. Well, it's great to welcome Carmen with us here today. I had just purchased her book, and I was sitting there, and then along came Sue Sorensen, who works at CMU, and came and talked about her and about her book, and I went, yeah, I just purchased it. Anyway, so it ended up that we talked about bringing her to Winnipeg. So here she is with us here at St. John's College. She's going to be at CMU tonight for her book launch. And then she'll be tomorrow, you're at Meadowood United Church, right? So, and it's good to welcome you. So this is from one of your, was he a student or a participant in a thing? A youth leader, okay, here we go. I'll just read a little bit of the more serious parts. The Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne is Assistant Professor of United Church, Canada Studies at Emmanuel College, Victoria University, and the University of Toronto. She holds a PhD in Disciplinary Studies from the Graduate Theological Union and is an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada. The Very Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne is a mother, a spouse, a friend, and an ice cream critic. Oh, and also once served as the moderator of the United Church of Canada, allegedly. You were the first Indigenous woman to serve as the moderator of the United Church. Instead of listing all the wonderful things in which Carmen Lansdowne is capable, it deemed prudent to include the far shorter list of things she is unable to do. Maintaining a healthy sleep schedule and walking downstairs are both areas where, tragically, the moderator comes up below average. One disgruntled United Church member, her son Gabriel, shared that her greatest weakness may be staying at home. Other than that, she's just about ticked every box. Carmen was the first Indigenous woman to hold the role of the United Church moderator, has attended school longer than most youth and young adults that have been alive, and has been praised as an incredibly talented churchy person. It's been rumored that she recently took a consultative role in NASA's Lazarus Project initiative and worked undercover in the San Pedro Alligator Wrestling League for 7 years. But you might have to fact check the last two. These are just a few of the outstanding feats Carmen has accomplished over her life, and if they are any indicator, the church is blessed to be gifted with her ministry. All in all, Carmen Lansdowne is an intelligent, wise, educated, versatile, sharp-tongued, strong swagger, funkylicious pastor and preacher, scholar and speaker, who is absolutely goated with the sauce. And if anyone would ever hope to bribe her, definitely avoid bringing Carmen fancy ice cream, as she will ravage your ego and destroy your soul. Or at least she might tease you for liking specialty craft ice cream flavors. I'm glad to welcome Carmen Lansdowne.
Thank you. So that unofficial biography was written by Eli Kanhai, who's actually from here in Winnipeg. And we were at a national joint youth ministry conference for young people from across the country for both the Presbyterian and United Churches last summer. And I was like, Eli, you have to write me a bio that is like more interesting than the official one that's on the United Church website. And the backstory to the ice cream, I feel like I have to defend myself all the time on this one. So my daughter and I had come out for the Prairie to Pine Regional Council meeting, which is the region of the church, of the United Church that is like all of Manitoba and then like up into like towards Kenora, Thunder Bay area. So it goes up into northwestern Ontario. And Eli and his siblings were as part of the youth gathering, and I went as moderator to go and meet with him, and my daughter was there. And so as part of the opening circle, there was probably about 45 kids that were 16 and under. And they had to say their name, their pronouns, community of faith that they were affiliated with, and their favorite ice cream. And so all of these kids went around, and you got all of like, chocolate, strawberry, vanilla, bubblegum, cookies and cream. That was like everybody's favorites. except for Eli and his siblings, were like Earl Grey tea, saffron mango, and like maple bacon or something like that. And I've known their mom for a long time, and so I was like, where are you taking your kids for ice cream? So that's the backstory. I did not, in fact, work undercover for the San Pedro Alligator Wrestling League or for NASA's Lazarus Project. I don't even know what NASA's Lazarus Project is. Oh, I'm really happy to be here, and also somewhat embarrassed about the fact that people are interested in my book at all. It has a beautiful cover and I guess an intriguing title, and is also like a scholarly monograph in theology, and it's not for everybody. And so just a disclaimer to say that it's not necessarily an easy read unless you have had like formal graduate studies in theology. But I did make a study guide that's available on my website, because my mom and some others in the congregation where she worships in the north end of Vancouver Island, that where there is a lay-led congregation, they really wanted to read it and understand it because they were excited when it came out. And so I actually am using like the first couple of pages of the study guide as the sort of intro to my talk, just because that way I don't go too far into the weeds with big words that are not so interesting to anybody except for maybe me and Ryan. I will also start with a funny story. When I first acknowledged my call to ministry, I was really clear about like feeling called to ministry. And then shortly, I think probably in my first year of my MDiv studies, I thought, I could have impact by working in congregational ministry, or I also feel like I may have this very unique worldview that straddles like traditional ways and being Indigenous in Canada, and also can speak in a way that relates to the non-Indigenous church and to wider Canadian society. And maybe I would have more impact if I became a professor of theology and could teach people who are going into ministry. And so during my MDiv studies, I started to work towards doing a second master's degree in theology, and then went on to do my PhD. And I had a really great mentor. She was a Lutheran professor named Sharon Betcher, who wrote on disability studies and theology. And she was like, you have to start going to academic conferences, and here's how you do it. And she really kind of guided me through that process. And there was a paper that I had written I ended up writing several different versions of the same paper that sort of got more rigorous in terms of academic standards over a couple of degrees, but eventually published it in a book called Theology and the Crisis of Engagement. And it looked at like how hard it is to tell stories Indigenous stories in the academy, because the discipline of history is so strict about what counts as a valid historical source, which is written records. And there's primary sources and secondary sources. The primary source is like, if I, 100 years from now found your journal, that would be a primary source, right? Like you were writing about contemporary events as they happen. And then a secondary source would be if Ryan was studying your journal and wrote about that. And so I'd have like these two different written sources that could validate each other. And I was sort of dealing with this idea of like, how do you tell the story of what happened in colonized Canada, what is happening in colonized Canada, in a way that tells the truth from an Indigenous perspective when there's no sources to use to prove that. And so I made an argument that we actually should be able to use poetry and film and art to tell history from an Indigenous perspective, because it tells our truth with a capital T, even though it's sort of like outside the bounds of what would be traditionally accepted in the academy from the discipline of history. And so that was sort of when I fell in love with this idea of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. And I went to the UVic graduate studies conference in history at Parksville, which is an annual event that they have every year. And some professors present papers, but it's mostly an opportunity for master's and doctoral students to start to present their work in a safe space. And I had done a history degree at UVic for my undergrad, and so I was presenting in front of people that had been my professors. And it was received really well. It was controversial, but in a good way. And so there was lots of conversations over dinner and, at the pub later that night when people were playing pool and stuff. And I came home and I was very excited because I felt very affirmed in this decision to go into postgraduate study. And neither of my parents graduated from high school. They were commercial fishers. And I came home and they said, "How was your conference?" And I was like, "It was great." And they said, "Great. Why was it awesome?" And so I told them, and they said, "Well, can you read us your paper?" And I was like, "Sure. Are you sure?" And they're like, "Yeah, read us your paper." So I read them my paper, and my mom said, "It sounds really good, but why did you keep talking about pissing?" And I'm like, "No, Mom, not pissing. Epistemology. It's the study of knowledge." She said, "Oh, good, my girl. I thought you were like, why is she swearing in front of all these professors?" So now I always have this joke that if I get too in the weeds in academic talk, then just to raise your hand and say, "Carmen, it's too much pissing." I went to an ordination service for an Ojibwe man from Christian Island on Sunday in Georgian Bay, and it's a real small, on reserve United Church that's been there for a long time. And I got to tell that story at the start of my sermon because so many people from the community that were involved in the service were having a hard time saying ordination. So I was like, I feel like I found my mom's people. So first I wanted to just share why I wrote my book. And originally it's the published version of my dissertation, which was sort of the outcome of my work in my doctoral studies. And the original title of my dissertation was actually called Bearing Witness. And then this was the subtitle, Wearing a Broken Indigene Heart on the Sleeve of the Missio Dei, which is a fancy way of saying mission or Christian mission. And the Missio Dei was sort of this move in the mid-20th century that tried to say, actually, mission is not what the church does. The church is part of God's mission and how God reveals God's self in the world. And I grew up in a denomination in the United Church that really did not like to talk about mission and evangelism. And those two, in the wider ecumenical movement, we actually talk about those two terms together. So one is mission in the sense of the church's mission in sending missionaries, fulfilling the Great Commission to go out and make believers of the whole world, which was a lot of the church impetus behind colonialism and this idea of going out and conquering people who are not Euro-Christian descent. And evangelism is just sharing the good news. That's all that it really means. But evangelism tied to that particular definition of mission has been used as we have to convert souls for Christ, right? So more of a proselytism type of Christianity is better than everything else, and so therefore we must convert you to our way of seeing things. And so the United Church of Canada kind of came to a place where that's really destructive and not okay, and part of our sort of faith-based reason for why we operated residential schools and promoted Indigenous adoptions and tried to convert people that were not Christian, that were new Canadians. And that's destructive and harmful, and we should stop doing that. And so I grew up not really knowing much about mission or evangelism. And so it was towards the end of my MDiv degree, I took a class in mission, church, and ministry with an Anglican professor named Richard Leggett, who's just a tremendous professor. And we read a book called Transforming Mission by the late South African missiologist David Bosch. That was he wrote this Bible on mission and evangelism from an ecumenical perspective and said, here are all the strengths, here's the biblical roots in why it happens, here's what happens in terms of like how the church has interpreted it over time. And also we're going to start talking about the Missio Dei now to say that, or he kind of came on the heels of 3 or 4 decades of the church starting to say, we're going to talk about the Missio Dei to remind ourselves that it is God's mission, not the church's mission. And it was just a really, really beautiful book. And I thought, man, this is really important. This is really important for us to understand, because it's kind of the heart of Christianity, is like, how do we believe in the Christian message and then transmit that to each other and to the world in a way that is respectful and allows for our inherent differences and respects each other's cultures. So I became really fascinated with this idea of missiology. I had intended to do a PhD in Christian ethics, looking at like what Christianity would have to say in end stage like capitalism. And so I still read a lot of macroeconomics for fun. Actually, if you go to my like professional page, my Carmen Lansdowne PhD page on Facebook, I posted Joseph Stiglitz's big G20 report that came out yesterday. I was like, this is important. Everybody should read it. 65 pages of a global economics report. But I also grew up in a church that was like in decline and had been probably since the time my grandfather, my adopted grandfather in the 60 scoop side of my family, had been ordained. Like he joined sort of like at the peak of the United Church. He left the Anglican Church to become United Church because he was like, you know, the Christianity can be exciting and engaging, and why would anybody ever want to join the Anglican Church? Sorry to all, and I'm talking to a primarily Anglican audience, but that was my late grandfather's view in the 50s. And ever since then, the United Church had been in decline, much like the other mainline Protestant churches and Catholic Church in Canada. And I thought, you know, I wonder if one of the reasons we're in decline is that the church had this mid-century awareness of all of the ways that oppression gets intertwined with itself in the world. That as, you know, for better or for worse, I think like the Great Wars really created this cosmopolitan understanding of like we are multiple countries and multiple cultures living on one small planet, the third rock from the sun, and that this compulsion to dominate each other is not healthy, and we just saw that writ large in the First and Second World Wars. And so the churches were really grappling with this. And from my perspective, I felt like our church just kind of like threw out the idea of mission with the colonialist bathwater, right? Like we threw out the baby of the church, which was this idea of mission and evangelism, with the colonialist bathwater, and we're like, no, we're not going to try to convert anybody anymore. And it's hard to be Indigenous and Christian because of that history. It's hard to show up, especially in any type of leadership capacity, or in capacities where the Indigenous church is engaging with the wider non-Indigenous church within our denominations in Canada, because there's so much, there has been traditionally and continues to be some pretty willful continued ignorance about the history of colonization in this country. There's still a lot of implicit and explicit racism that exists in our churches. And so the question that I was trying to answer for myself as I grew in my interest of mission and evangelism, and also was taking on increasing leadership roles in the church, is how can I stay Christian at all, given all of this like hurt and baggage? And so this book is really like an exploration of those ideas. So what is still, what is important, what needs to be corrected, how are Indigenous worldviews and non-Indigenous, well, how are Indigenous worldviews and your Christian worldviews the same and different in general? So going back to that epistemological question of like, how do we define knowledge? How do we define what is true? And one of the things that I learned was that, I didn't study I didn't do a really deep dive into philosophy, but ever since like the Greek philosophers, we've had this idea that We can use logic and what they call a justified truth claim, right? That we can say A plus B equals C because all of these things exist. And so if you say, well, this happened because this happened because this happened because this happened because this happened, like all the way back to the very source of truth, then you can say this thing is justified as true because we can do this causal regression back to an original source and like an original thing that is like undeniably true. And what a lot of Indigenous scholars writing across a whole bunch of disciplines were saying was like, actually, no, that's a Euro-Christian culturally bounded idea that we don't actually, and it resulted in this idea later on in the Enlightenment that there was like a right and a wrong, right? That the purpose of trying to do this causal regression back to like an undeniable truth was that then you could say this is right and this is wrong. This is black and this is white and there's no gray. And so what these Indigenous scholars were writing about that I was reading is like, no, there's so much gray in the world. And actually this is a fundamental difference between Indigenous cultures more broadly and Euro-Christian forms of thinking. And I wasn't trying to make like a pan-Indigenous argument necessarily, but it's really hard to study like just a Heiltsuk worldview without spending like years and years and years at home interviewing elders and trying to like categorize everything in a way that didn't feel respectful or productive. And I was looking at in general, like how has the European mindset impacted our peoples in North America in terms of how we understand truth and untruth. And so one of the main differences is that we have these like binary ideas of truth in Euro-Christian traditions, and in Indigenous worldviews we allow for multiple truth claims. And so my truth comes from my experience, and my brother might have a completely different experience of the same event, and that both those things are true. We have polar opposite experiences of some of our parents' histories of parenting us. And that in a traditional worldview, like both those things are true. We're not trying to get at like factually what happened and what was our parents' intent. Like we just each have our own truth. And that, which kind of then ties into the purpose of history. And so history in Euro-Christian worldviews has like developed into this discipline where we're focused on the chronology, time as chronology, right? So we start at like 0 CE with the death of Christ, and we move to 2025, and history is a thing that kind of progresses through time. Whereas in Indigenous cultures, we tend to see history as cyclical, which means we have a much deeper understanding of how our past is connected to our present and how our present is connected to our future. And so, and the purpose of history is not to establish fact. It's not to participate in this like creating justified truth claims, but it's actually to say there's a right action that comes out of telling a story, right? That stories are pedagogical and ethical in purpose, that we tell our histories in order to determine what's the next right action for me today. And so the facts of a story might change depending on why you're telling it, because the purpose is to teach a lesson, to teach a way to be in right relationship with each other and with the whole of the created order that Creator loves. So that was another major kind of cultural difference that I found. And so I kind of said, okay, if we take these big shifts in cultural differences between Indigenous cultures generally and Euro-Christian cultures generally, and we apply that to Christian mission, could we actually reclaim this idea of Christian mission and the Missio Dei as a life-giving force whereby we can share the fact that there are really important good nuggets of truth in the Christian scriptures, aside from all of the crappy stuff that the churches have done, but there's like a salvific presence of the Christian faith that can be a healing force in the world. could we create an understanding of Christianity that is actually more inclusive and life-giving? So instead of like focusing on what's in and what's out, what's right and what's wrong, to like really rumble with the scriptures together to say, what's the next right thing for us to do together as humans walking in this world together in partnership? And so that's like really the heart of what's at my book. And I'm sorry that I didn't just write all those beautiful words that I just said, and instead I wrote an academic text. What else do I want to say about it? In order to create my study guide, I asked Google Notebook, which is an AI, to help me to like say like what's important or what happens in my book. And so the AI told me that there's 3 different lenses that you can read my book through. The first is through an Indigenous lens. So I talk a lot about prioritizing Indigenous voices and epistemologies, that it's necessary to center Indigenous experience and story, because when we talk about the experience of people who are made marginal or oppressed by systems in society, it makes it easier to see the systems that are causing that oppression. And so I think this is probably one of the areas where we struggle the most in Canada and in other colonized countries, is because you have like whatever the dominant normative society says is focused on intent and fact, and Indigenous communities tend to be focused on experience and the truth of what's happened to us, and without telling those stories, the systems that allow for that oppression to happen can remain invisible because they are part of what's normalized, right? If you look at poverty in this country, and not the Indigenous racialization of poverty, but just poverty more broadly, there's so much stigma against those who are most impoverished in this country, as if their poverty is a personal moral failing or their inability to budget, and not about the fact that we've allowed for our economic systems to financialize everything, to make everything a method of profit, including our sharing on social media and the cost of land. And so unless you hear the stories of those who are most impoverished, it becomes really hard to notice the trends that are happening, where we start to see things like rent evictions, or start to question like how are real estate investment trusts causing the financialization of housing. And so you would only have those who are making decisions in like big banking systems talking about how supply and demand is going to solve our housing crisis, right? But you actually have to start listening to those who are impoverished because they can't afford housing anymore, telling stories that weave a much more complicated picture that can start to shed some light on where the economic systems and the political systems in this country are creating unhousing, and they're creating poverty, and they're perpetuating poverty. Likewise, like most of our social safety nets are like not set up to serve people who are like, people aren't falling through the cracks, right? The social safety net is like, if you can think of like a trapeze artist in a circus, and they always have a safety net underneath, but you always have about like 8 to 10 feet of space underneath the safety net where like other staff can go and things like that. And because when the safety net kind of like catches somebody, it drops down. So you wouldn't want to put it right on the floor. There wouldn't be any point. Our social safety nets are like that. They're built like above the ground, but because they're built for like people who already have a certain amount of power and privilege in society and already have a certain amount of means. So they're just accessing systems that are meant to help them to stop from falling into a crack. But there's a whole bunch of people that exist in this country whose whole existence like is below where you could even access the safety net. And so it's really important for us, whether we're talking about Indigenous people or whether we're talking about poor people, whether we're talking about the impact of cisgendered heterosexist stuff and like, without listening to trans people. It's listening to those stories of the people that are made most marginal in our society that will actually help to show where there's systems of oppression that are like pushing down on them, or whether or not a social safety net and a social contract is set like above anything that they could even access. And so that's a really important lens that we have to use when we're doing theology. The second is a focus on right action and relationships. And so I already talked about how like the purpose of history is pedagogical and ethical, that we're trying to like teach each other something by telling our histories, and we're trying to choose what's the next right action about how we're in relationship with each other and with the created order. And not just for the sake of theorizing about knowledge, but for determining what is right action within the moral universe. So human relationships are focused on the other, on the right of the other to exist, and that they have their own inherent dignity, rather than like a purely internal inquiry. And so, I'm thinking of this Palestinian poet, Dina Omar, who's actually a PhD candidate at Yale in social cultural and social geography or something, I can't remember. But she wrote this poem in the early 2000s called First Time Home, and she talks about the first time that she went to Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories, and how the land in Jaffa that is now Israeli but used to be Palestinian, and she's like, and that home belonged to so-and-so from somewhere, and that home belonged to so-and-so from somewhere, and that home belonged to so-and-so from this family, and that home belonged to my mother, right? That this philosophical debate around which borders are we going to recognize in Israel and Palestine is irrelevant, because there's like a real tangible relationship that existed two generations ago between her grandparents and what was the Palestinian territory before the creation of the state of Israel. And that's the same in terms of focusing on right action and relationships. And so we can see it like writ large right now in Canada with our current government trying to push through Bill 5 and these like big infrastructure projects. And we've had, since the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1996, and then the TRC, and then the Special Interlocutor, and the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, we've had all of these like ideas about how do we fix what has happened in Canada over the last 500 years. But then they're only ideas. They're not like from our perspective, like it's like there's work to do, right? There's work to do to repair this relationship. But I think for non-Indigenous people, sometimes they're ideas. And so it's like, okay, well, those ideas don't matter right now, because what matters right now is elbows up and building a country that is like, more resilient against our dark overlords to the south, which I have a different perspective on that anyway. I am a dual citizen of Canada and US. I recognize my J Treaty right to live and work in either country without impediment. And for me, it's like, same bullshit, different colonial overlord. like, but it becomes easy to say, well, that idea can't matter right now because this idea matters more. That there's this binary dualism that exists, that I think if we approach things from an Indigenous perspective, we'd say, okay, yeah, the US right now in its current administration is a real threat to Canada. And as much as I celebrate my right to be a dual citizen, I know I would I do choose to live here rather than there right now, especially because my husband's Guatemalan and he was an undocumented worker for 10 years before we got married. And if he crossed the border right now, likely he'd be detained and get sent somewhere. And he'd actually be stateless because he's only an American citizen. He's no longer Guatemalan and he's not yet Canadian. So the risk to him is huge. But given that reality south of the border and how it impacts us in Canada, And given all the things that we've identified as places where we need to work to make things right in this country in terms of our relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, like we got to sit down at a table together and really work through this. Like this is the time to build relationships and to make things stronger. And that is slow and hard work. And so in the interest of like getting things done as efficiently and as quickly as possible, the government said like, no, it's either or. We can't do both right now. So we're going to focus on building pipelines. We're going to focus on building big infrastructure. And we do that in the church. Like I'm picking on the government right now. But we did that in the United Church. When we 7 years ago looked at or restructured our church and got rid of presbyteries, that's exactly what we did. The comprehensive review task group that was tasked with saying, okay, the current structure with 4 courts of the church from our congregations, our presbyteries, our regional or provincial conferences, and then our general council feels really burdensome and like it's too much work for an aging church in decline. How can we do things differently? And I think presbytery got like, I don't know, it got a bad rap in that process because it was the thing that was immediate and more tangible to more people. And so people were like, we're tired, we don't want to do that anymore. But here in this province, in Manitoba, we had probably the most functional presbytery in the country, which is Keewatin Presbytery, which was a miracle in the Indigenous church because it was functionally trilingual and operated in Cree, Oji-Cree, and Anishinaabe languages. And when the task group met with Keewatin Presbytery, I think the elders, I wasn't there, but what I heard was there was a lot of conflict, and the elders in the church in Keewatin Presbytery were yelling at the representatives from the task group, and in a way that felt disrespectful to the non-Indigenous people that were there. And so they walked away instead of like, you know, being grown-ass adults and using bone family systems to be like, okay, well, what's actually going on here? Why are you yelling at me? And practicing empathy and compassion and curiosity. So they walked away, and then they said, okay, well, for the rest of the church, they seem to want to get rid of presbyteries. And so we haven't really been able to have adequate consultation with Indigenous peoples. But we've done all this other work. The rest of the church is ready to move on. So we're going to say that the Indigenous church will have to figure it out its own way. We wouldn't dare to say what that is. So they at least, you know, didn't try to impose a one-size-fits-all solution on the Indigenous church. But we're going to move ahead, and then they can figure that out later. And I was watching this happen from California while I was doing my PhD, and I was like, oh my gosh, you guys are like, you're going to break this relationship because you're saying that like you're behind us again, and you're not important enough to wait for. And the result of that has been a whole bunch of lateral violence within the Indigenous church. They're fighting each other now because they don't have enough power to fight the white people that made this decision for them. And so they're fighting each other, and it's destroying the Indigenous church. Like that's that same dynamic as what's happening now in our political system with these infrastructure bills is the exact same thing that we did to the Indigenous church 7 years ago in my denomination. The other Indigenous lenses we can look at is just taking a holistic and interconnected view, that everything environmental, political, social, religious, intellectual, that these things are all connected to each other for us, right? That we don't have these silos of like, well, this is a political discussion and that's an environmental discussion. And, you know, it's such an important way to look at the world. And it gets trivialized in a way that is really, really unfortunate, right? Like we often will bring out Indigenous scholars to say, okay, well, talk to us about the importance of like care for creation. But then like, because we do that in a way that's telling stories and isn't like, here's where, you know, Joseph Stiglitz is right in his new report to the G20 and here's where he's wrong. There's like a cross-cultural lack of ability to implement the wisdom that's coming from those stories. And also, sometimes I think people go, well, we asked them to come and talk to us about climate change, and then they told us a story about, their grandparents doing one thing, and they can't translate the wisdom that's coming from that story. And so it feels like, what they said was just like not important or not related. But that's because we can often see those interconnections in a way that's really hard for people who don't come from our cultures to be able to see them. And then the last thing is just this idea of rejecting binary dualisms. And so, again, going back to the Enlightenment, Rene Descartes would talk a lot about binary dualisms, like the difference between our mind and our bodies, or right and wrong. And that is just like not something that was part of our worldviews. And so, and even this whole idea of like two-spirit gender, right, was like, like many people identify as women and many people identify as men. And there's like these genderqueer folks that like don't fit into either category, and it's not the feminization of masculinity or the masculization of femininity. It's just this whole other third space of holding a different balance of gender identity. And I think some of our cultures have lost that. I'm aware that I'm talking for a long time, so I'm going to try and finish up. The second lens is a decolonial lens. And so I think it's important for us in churches to talk about the difference between indigenizing and decolonizing. So indigenizing is like making sure that those Indigenous voices are present and that Indigenous perspectives are being included and Indigenous stories are being included. But decolonizing is really recognizing that colonization is not an event that is over, but it is a way of thinking about the world, and is an ongoing process that continues to shape the realities of Indigenous people and other racialized people in North America. There's this idea of like the logic of genocide, where non-Indigenous people assume that Indigenous peoples must disappear in order to, and I think this is more true in the United States than here, because the TRC like really kind of blew open our whole reality of having to sort out our current circumstance and our history together. But in the States, it's like when you talk about race relations in the States, it's like anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, Islamophobia. Like Indigenous people don't even fit into the discourse at all. And there's like it's like a significant percentage of Americans that actually don't think that there's any surviving Indigenous people in the USA, right? And I'd read that before. And then my children hit school age when I was in Ferndale, Washington. And my son came home one day in kindergarten and was talking about how where we lived in Ferndale in Whatcom County used to be the traditional territory of the Lummi, but then the pioneers came and the Indians were all gone. And I'm like, no, they're not. And he's like, yeah, no, the pioneers came and now there's no more Indigenous people that live here. I was like, we were literally on the Lummi Reserve 2 days ago to visit your Auntie Kathy. And he's like, no, they're all gone. And I was like, no, like where your Auntie Vina lives is Lummi territory. I was like, it's constrained to that reserve now. And so they might not be in Ferndale proper, but like they're still our neighbors. And he's like, no. So he was actively, like what he got taught in kindergarten was that the Lummi people no longer existed. And then he said, Mom, did the Indians know how to drive? And I had this like, WTF, why is that a past tense question? But I had a good like pause and I filtered myself and I said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, Granny knows how to drive and you know how to drive. So I say yes. I was like, all right. Okay, this is just like 5-year-old logic. It had nothing to do with actually thinking. But, like that's how that gets normalized, that thinking that like Indigenous people don't exist in the United States is because that's the way that it's presented in class. We have to think about decolonization as active resistance against the colonial forces that exploit our minds, our bodies, our land. And I think for non-Indigenous people, this will involve disrupting those Euro-Christian epistemologies and challenging systems that privilege people of European descent. And it's hard, messy work. When Michael Ignatieff was running for leadership of the Liberal Party, My dad was still fishing, and his whole crew is Indigenous, including me and my brother. And my dad really likes to read. And I had bought him a couple of Michael Ignatieff's books, and because I was like, I know that you will find this interesting. And so my adopted older brother, Rick, who's a hereditary chief in the Kwakwaka'wakw territory from Guilford Island, he said, I really like what this guy Michael Ignatieff's writing about like, it was sort of the same idea of like all people in Canada are created equal. And my dad said, well, you've been sold a bill of goods. And Coke said, well, what do you mean? And he said, you live like that first sentence that says all Canadians are created equal. He's like, we're not. First of all, that's not the reality for you and your lived experience as a Kwakwaka'wakw man. But secondly, you have inherent rights that are different from other Canadians as an Indigenous person in this country. And it is not equal. And you do have rights that are privileged against, like, over and against non-Indigenous people. And Rick was like, holy crap, I do. But like, it's as simple and as distressingly difficult as that, to pick out one sentence in a book from an Indigenous leader and just to say, is this actually true? It seems like a really simple liberal idea that we're all created equal. And the second that we allow people to perpetuate that, we're negating the fact that this country was colonized and exists at the expense of Indigenous people. And then the easier part, I think, for probably most of the people in this room is like confronting denial and complicity. So, I think of the asshat that got elected in my parents' riding. I don't like him so much. I don't even remember his name. But he's a residential school denier. Or maybe Sean Orr? I don't know. He's really close to the leader of the opposition, and he was very controversial. He was parachuted into that riding, and it's a riding that has a really high percentage of Indigenous voters that are pretty disengaged and don't vote. And then a lot of miners and loggers that kind of swing between orange and blue, who are really, driving around with their Fuck Trudeau flags on their trucks. And so they all wanted to vote for the Conservatives because they were tired of the Liberal government. And then because of what was happening south of the border and this like red wave that kind of took over our last election, a lot of the Indigenous people that did vote just wanted to believe that Mark Carney would make things better, and so voted for the Liberal candidate in a riding that has never had a Liberal MP in their entire history, instead of voting for the NDP candidate who could have won if everybody who'd voted NDP and everybody who had voted Liberal had voted NDP, right? But what was good about that election cycle is that how many people came out and saying, actually, what this guy is saying is wrong and untrue, and we believe survivors and we believe the families, and that is just like a baseline of truth. And then the last piece of my book is looking through a political theological lens. Osage theologian Tinker argued in his book that came out in 2008, American Indian Liberation, A Theology of Sovereignty, that all Indigenous theology is political theology. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is because of this idea of being grounded in relationship and trying to choose right action in the moral universe. But the other is because you can't exist as an Indigenous person in North America without politics affecting every aspect of your life. And so you can't actually write theology from an Indigenous perspective without it being political theology. There was that piece around reclaiming this idea of the Missio Dei, but in a way that is committed to that right action and being in right relationship with each other. And then looking at power analysis and who has the power within the church and within society. And one last really important piece around the different Indigenous and Euro-Christian views on dialogue, whereas non-Indigenous or Euro-Christian traditions tend to see dialogue as like a means to an end. Like, if we have this dialogue, we will solve that problem. Whereas Indigenous cultures, like, dialogue is the purpose itself, is about building relationships and knowing each other's truths and knowing each other well enough that, like, your prayers become my prayers. That I know your heart well enough that like the burdens that you carry become my burdens that I carry. And I think that if the church could do that better, that we would be in a very different position. And then the last thing is just that theology matters. The late Sally McFaig, who's an Anglican theologian, was my professor of theology at the Vancouver School of Theology, talked about in my very first class with her, those were the first two words out of her mouth, is theology matters. What we think and believe and write and speak about God matters. Because we believe that God is both here with us through the Christian story and in the ways that God, through Spirit, reveals God's self to us, but also that God is so much more than anything we can comprehend and has a power that is far exceeding what any of us as inherent created beings have on this earth. And so when we dare to talk about what we think or believe about Creator, that matters. And that we have to do that with care and attention and deep respect and also a lot of humility. So that's what my book's about. I talked for like 45 minutes, so maybe I'll just stop and see if there's any questions or, yeah. I didn't think I was going to be able to talk about it for 45 minutes in a way that was like not too much pissing. But I did it. Everybody wants cookies. There's cookies in the back. I'll repeat the questions just because we're recording this for Ryan to be able to post it later. And so I'll repeat so that you guys can hear in the back too. And then we don't have to run one mic around multiple places. Yeah. So the question is that if Indigenous knowledge is really rooted in an understand, like in our relationship with land and in, I think also with particular place, then how is that important for Christianity in terms of the relationship with Indigenous theology? So, yeah. I think that I talk about that in my book, but I can't remember, but I'll just say what I think about it, which is I think it's that's actually a really important teaching that we can share with the church, right? Like, try to think about, like, there was a conversation I had with a retired minister in Vancouver who really struggled with the idea of being called a settler in this country, because he saw settler thinking as a function of the sort of like landed gentry that were the original colonial masters of this country that like gave out the land grants or whatever, and that he came from a very oppressed and impoverished Scottish lineage where they came here seeking liberation and seeking freedom. And so my question to somebody whose struggle around being identified with like the colonial power in this country is that there's still colonialist thinking in that you can be uprooted and go somewhere else in order to find that liberation, right? Like for so many, like we have 75% of Indigenous people in this country don't live in their traditional territories anymore because they've been actively or economically displaced or displaced through Bill C-31, where we had huge numbers of Indigenous women who were sort of reinstated or instated with their status, but like it didn't, there was no reparations to go along with that provided for more land or more housing on our reserves. And, you know, to be Heiltsuk is to be from Heiltsuk territory, right? And I'm one of my traditional names in Kwakwala from that older adopted brother Rick, who fished with my family, is Kwisolak, which means woman who travels to places far away. So like I feel like being this sort of peripatetic theologian that travels all over the world and in service of the church and as an academic, that's just part of who I am. And like my community and my family have lifted me up in that way. But there's an understanding, like I have a connection to Kwakwaka'wakw territory where I was born, and where my dad's a third generation settler, like British homesteader. And then there's like a whole different like visceral connection to the central coast of BC, where we've been for, at least 15,000 years that we can prove. But there's also, I've had the experience of going to the Lakes District outside of Bath and Bristol in England, where my dad's biological family is from, his family of origin is from, I guess. Doesn't have an adopted family, but where his family is from. And feeling like, oh, this is also home. Like my body knows that that's where that half of my people are from. And so instead of like pushing back against this idea of like, oh, well, I'm not a settler because I wasn't part of like the colonial power structure, is to be like, what was it in your people that like could just abandon that connection to where you're from so wholeheartedly? And like, if you want to understand the relationship between Indigenous people and settler colonial thinking in North America, like understand what happened in Scotland that caused that oppression to your people that allowed them to seek liberation here, right? Like colonization worked in all of the places it's worked in the last 500 years because it was already happening in Europe. There was already colonization of the Irish, the Welsh, the Scottish, the Frisians in Scandinavia, the Sami in Scandinavia, the Roma in continental Europe. And so like this disconnection from land is actually like a really huge key to understanding settler colonialism in a way that's really important. Yeah. I'm going to say what I didn't do before I said I wasn't going to do, but I think because it is getting recorded, I'm going to pass you the microphone. And I'm sorry I didn't do that with you either, because probably the beautiful things you said won't get picked up on the recording.
Yeah, I'll go for your presentation. I'll say that again. Well done. I look forward to reading your book. I'm from Gutnawage, just south of Tiohtià:ke, and Catholic community, principally, I would say. But over the last little while, there is, of course, yes, but the Catholic Church is a force, let's say, and it's your exploration in your talk over Indigenous theology. In the advert for it mentions that, and I'm wondering if you could hover over that, because where I come from, sometimes it's difficult to explore the distinction and the similarities, as was mentioned just a moment ago, between different faith traditions, the traditional approaches toward understanding our world and our relationships amongst Ungwehunwe and those of, I'll focus on the Catholic Church. I'm a baptized Catholic, so maybe that's why I'm focusing on that as well. And the extent to which such things as, well, you mentioned colonizations generally, I would say, the language use, I would say, really does impact that. When people say they're praying back home, half the time I don't know what they mean when they say such things, and that's a long conversation to have. But I'm just wondering if you could hover over the notion of what Indigenous theology is. You sort of spoke of truth earlier in your talk, and maybe that's a part of it. And if there's any distinctions that merit mention, it might be helpful. Yeah.
Gascha, that's a great question. I think from the perspective of my book, it is like, I don't necessarily think I like defined Indigenous theology necessarily. And I would say there's not a lot of Indigenous theologians, right? Like within like the discipline of theology as an academic subject. In North America, there's Tink Tinker. Jace Weaver kind of like moved more over in towards religious studies. Andrea Smith was trained as a theologian, but now her indigenate, like she got outed by the New York Times, like pretty harshly, like, yeah, but I'm thinking in terms of like published authors, like Andy Smith was really famous, but then now she's like been outed as a pretendian. But like so Jonathan at VicU, who's I'm teaching his class next semester while he's on sabbatical. Robert Smith, who's Chickasaw at the University of North Texas. Vance Blackfox, who's also ELCA. He's the director for Indigenous Ministries for the Lutheran Church in the States. Like Ray Aldred and Adrian Jacobs here in Canada. Oh my God, I can see his face from Nate's. Terry, but probably on two hands you could name the people who are like writing and thinking compared to like the 5,000 members of the American Academy of Religion. Like we're a pretty small group. And so like when I'm talking about Indigenous theology, I'm talking specifically about Christian theology from an Indigenous perspective. So like indigenizing Christianity. I got asked to write a Heiltsuk feminist theology for a big academic publisher. And I find like to write a Heiltsuk theology to me would be a very different thing because like in the Theologia India movement in Latin America, which is the project that was sponsored by the Conference of Roman Catholic Bishops in Latin America, Nicanor Sarmiento, who used to be here in Winnipeg, was a Quechua theologian. He's an amazing man. He's Quechua from Cusco, Peru. Quechua was his first language. Spanish was his second language. He was ordained as a Quechua spiritual leader first and then ordained as an oblate priest second. When he graduated from seminary, his provincial said to him, "Hey, how would you feel about going to work in Davis Inlet in Canada in an Indigenous community?" He was like, "Great, sign me up," because he thought it was a joke. And 2 months later, he got a letter from the Canadian Provincial of the Oblates saying, "We're so glad that you've agreed to come to Davis Inlet, where people only spoke Ainu or French." And so he got sent there, learned Ainu, then learned French, then learned English, was the priest that replaced somebody who his immediate predecessor had abused like scores of kids and had to like rebuild relationship in that community. I don't know why I'm talking about Nicanor. How did I get on that topic? So Nicanor has written like in Spanish about like traditional Quechua spiritualities and cosmovisions, and in a way that I think, oh yeah, I was talking about the Conference of Catholic Bishops. So the Theologia India movement basically said Indigenous theology has to be Indigenous theology and Indigenous Christian theology. And we're not going to separate them two, even within the Roman Catholic Church, because our primary identification is our experience of being Indigenous. Whether we're practicing traditional spiritualities, which we would not classify as like religious if we're trying to classify things, or whether or not you're an Indigenous Roman Catholic, or if you're an Indigenous Protestant in Latin America. So the Theologia India movement really tried to say there are multiple religious belongings and multiple spiritualities within Indigenous theology. We haven't had that conversation, I don't think, so much in North America. So for me, I would find it like I've been asked to write a Heiltsuk feminist theology, which I actually find really challenging to think about. There was the first Native American woman in North America to get her PhD in philosophy was a woman. She was a Dene woman from Navajo territory named Viola Cordova. she only ever taught in like a junior college setting. She didn't publish a lot. Her partner and a bunch of her students edited a collection of her work posthumously after she died. And she talks about how in Western philosophy, if you have this Cartesian idea of I think, therefore I am, right? Descartes' famous line, I think, therefore I am, that the Indigenous equivalent would be we are, therefore we are, therefore I am. Like, it is our collective existence that is the reason that I am, not the fact that I have like conscious ability and intellect. And so I thought, okay, if I was going to write a Hiltzik feminist theology, it couldn't just be my ideas. It would have to actually be like a pretty in-depth, like field work, doing work with the women leaders in my community to say, how do we think about God? Do you are you Christian or are you not Christian? Like, what's your relationship with spirit? How do you think that spirit shows up in the world? What is prayer like for you? To like have conversations to parse some of that out, but it would have to be like co-authored between me and the Minuyex Council at home, which is our Women's Leadership Council, right? So for me, when I talk about Indigenous theology, I'm talking about Indigenous Christian theology, but I don't think it has to be that. I just haven't seen Indigenous theology yet in the academy so much, except for people who are writing about their own spiritualities and sort of like Indigenous biography, sharing about their reclaiming traditional spiritual practices. Like, that's starting to show up a little bit, or a lot. It's certainly happening in our embodied lives, like outside of what's being written. People are really reconnecting. You know, when I was growing up, nobody did ritual bathing. Like, they're in our community. We didn't smudge in the same way that people here do. We have medicines that we burned, but it wasn't the same as smudging here. But we did have ritual bathing, and so you would like go into a river or go into the ocean like 4 times. We would flog ourselves with hemlock branches. Actually, I have hemlock like tattooed on my arm with my Hiltzik crest. It was, I think it had like the same benefits as like the Scandinavian hot, cold, relax practice of like being in a sauna and then like going, it's really good for your nervous system to go into cold water. And it was also like how we washed, but it was a ritual like purification piece, and nobody did that when I was growing up because that was probably really strongly discouraged in residential schools. But there was still enough, that knowledge wasn't sleeping completely. And so that practice has been reclaimed. And now I know so many people in Hiltzik and Kwakwakwa territories that do it like every day, or if not every day, like before they go have to make an important decision or things like that. And so, it may be that we end up having, I would love to see a more diverse perspective on Indigenous theologies happening in North America, and maybe it'll come, but I also think we are just many people focused. I feel a huge amount of privilege to be able to talk about these like really lofty ideas when so many leaders in our communities are just trying to figure out how to support people from to recover from all of the intergenerational trauma of like colonization, residential schools, 60 scoop, FAE, like all the things that are hard for us, the what I call the failed end state of all of our, all the things that we do to try and medicate ourselves from being traumatized over and over again. So I think it'll come.